Hello, everyone. As you come in, please give us a few minutes. We have participants joining us. So we will start maybe in at just about 2 minutes. Thank you so much for coming. Wonderful. The numbers are still going up. Participants are still joining. Great to have you all here. Welcome. Fantastic. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Milani Douglas, and I am the Director of Public Programs here at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. On behalf of our director, Susan Fisher-Sterling, and our board of directors, I welcome you to our first talk, Photographic Power. This conversation is a part of our Writing the Balance series, where we explore solutions to bring women artists and curators to the forefront. I would like to extend a sincere gratitude to our donors who have been very generous as far as supporting our work and throughout the pandemic. A lot of changes have happened, but our donors and their support has remained the same. Can we go to the next slide? I also would like to extend our support or extend our gratitude to the UK Friends of NMWA. Thank you for the collaboration in making this happen. We would like to highlight our Denise Littlefield-Sobel, the Dowry Davis Family Fund, the Rivada Foundation, and the Logan Family, and the Susan and Jim Schwartz Public Programs Fund. It has been a pleasure to work with the UK committee as we have had a chance to be able to learn more about what's happening in the UK and also how that's impacting and supporting women artists globally. The Fresh Talk series is an initiative to have the museum's curated conversations that provides a platform for women to advance creative ideas and solutions. If you would like to see some of our past Fresh Talks, please go to our YouTube page to be able to see some of the very important conversations we had before. Hopefully, when the museum opens, the museum will open again. And towards the end of 2023, moving into 2024, we will have our first Fresh Talk in person. We are looking forward to it. It is a conversation that we usually are having over dinner and being able to have conversations. So we look forward to gathering with you again. If you are having any conversations or sharing anything online, please hashtag Fresh Talk for Change. We would love to have and continue the conversation with you. Tonight's conversation, we are looking forward to hearing from our speakers. Since the beginning, since its founding 35 years ago, the National Museum of Women in the Arts has championed women photographers. Early scale exhibitions like Carrie Mae Weems in 1993, A History of Women Photographers in 1997, made it clear that the museum's commitment to telling the story of women as pioneers and innovators in the photographic medium. To complement this programming, the museum has formed a collection of vintage 19th century prints and early 20th century images by prominent photojournalists and contemporary photographs by artists from 6 continents. The museum's photography collection is growing rapidly, and National Museum of Women in the Arts curators are especially focused on increasing holding by artists whose identities relate to Africa, Asia, and South America. In the partnership with the UK Friends Committee, a vibrant outreach committee for the museum, with the staff, we have directly experienced a dynamic photography scene across museums, galleries, collections, and art fairs in London in particular. And as NMWA plans for the reopening of its UK building in downtown Washington, D.C. in late 2023, it is reimagining the presentation of its photography collection and planning for a future photo-based exhibitions project. We are delighted to host this conversation with UK-based creators. This edition of Writing the Balance will illuminate new photographers and energizing creative ways of telling the story of women and non-binary artists and their contributions to photography. Without any delay, we will hear from our speakers and continue the conversation afterwards. First, we'll hear from Bindi Vora.
Thank you. Just share my screen. Bear with me. Here we go. So thank you so much, Milani, and to the National Women for the Arts for inviting me to be here with you today. So to briefly introduce who I am, I'm an interdisciplinary photographic artist, lecturer, and curator at Autograph. I'm also a member of the curatorial advisory board for Amberside Gallery in Newcastle. As an artist, I'm interested in ideas of perception and representation, questioning how our everyday surroundings can intersect with our lives. I often draw upon my personal archive of images that I've been collecting over the last decade or so as a starting point for new works. I'm interested in how these materials can be reused and recycled to create new narratives, but also be traced back to other works too, like interconnected tissues. For me, my practice, both curatorially and as an artist, are symbiotic. They work together. And to begin with, I wanted to share a couple of bodies of work that I've made recently, as well as an exhibition at Autograph that just opened a few weeks ago. So the first body of work is called Mountain of Salt. It's an expansive body of work that is made up of found images, appropriated text, and digital shape collages, initially conceptualized as a human response to the unfolding of COVID-19. In March 2020, as the pandemic gripped the world, I, like many others, became acutely aware of the landscape in which we were living in, where everything felt amplified, clinging to the news for updates, statistics, and curves, and in my own way, analyzing the myriad forms of information being shared. For me, it highlighted the way words and speech have a physical presence, a bearing upon us, and carry weight. This text-based series of collages focuses on the language that was used in that 18-month period and developed from the collecting of words and sentences derived from politicians, journalists, and individuals all sharing their commentary, thoughts, and updates related to the pandemic. As each wave and lockdown unfolded across the UK, the evolution of the works were further punctuated by many issues of global concern and moments that have affected us beyond the pandemic. Equality, hypervigilance, Brexit, pledges of reform, and prolonged moments of stillness are all encompassed and bookended with some of the more lighthearted moments experienced in these times. The language was incredibly triggering, the way it's been pieced together, the connotations it conjured, and this huge emotional burden it continues to carry. The distinct rhetoric of collective responsibility, togetherness, and unity constantly being pushed onto us by those in positions of power is further amplified by the shapes that you see in the images. They aren't only there to direct your gaze across the images or to pause in certain spaces, but they contemplate the kind of real meaning of what these shapes represent, from circles and squares to diamonds. The title, Mountain of Salt, alludes to the idea of being on this continuous upward climb, but faced with the precarity of tumbling down at any moment. Through this work, I'm interested in how we might unite and reflect at this time currently being experienced in our individual and collective ways. The curious collection of phrases and photographs now are about 370, and it really speaks to the dissemination of language and its effect upon us. Most recently, I completed a work called As the Tides Grow Closer. It is a short experimental moving image piece, and it's the first time I've delved into film and making film. As my practice has grown over the last few years, I'm really interested in the expansive medium of photography. It's a piece I finished at the beginning of the year, but it's still growing, and I think there'll be a second and third chapter that evolves from this. The piece is comprised of archival footage from the Pralinga archives and material I've been making over the last 10 years, which have been montaged together. It explores the utopian ideas of freedom and the sublime contrasted against the dystopian reality of restricted movement. We are in an era of profound ecological and humanitarian crisis where the notion of home becomes even more pertinent. The sequence of frames are arranged as fragmentary portals or mirrors tethered to the world and seek to ask whether we are capable of change. Through the strategies of accumulation and abstraction, the collision and layering of sequence frames evoke both a stillness alongside a turbulent journey through shared waters governed by invisible lines and the fabrication of borders. I'm just going to play the film for you. If I move on briefly to my curatorial practice, so just under 4 years ago, I joined Autograph, where I am now a curator. And for those of you not familiar with Autograph, I'm sure Renee is going to do a very thorough introduction to our work, but it's a place to see things differently. Since 1988, Autograph has championed photographic and lens-based works that explore issues around race, representation, social justice, and human rights. I work very closely with Mark Seeley, our director, and of course, Renee, who is here with us tonight. I recently had the pleasure of curating Polomi Basu's solo exhibition, Fireflies. It's a deeply personal body of work that navigates trauma, resistance, freedom, and the power told through the relationship and personal experiences between the artist and her mother. The dialogue around this work really began almost 2 years ago, just before the pandemic gripped the world. Polomi was invited to take part in the Autograph Lightwork Artist Residency Program in Syracuse. And one of Autograph's core aims has always been to enable artists to develop their practice. And this partnership with Lightwork has been in existence since 1966, with artists including Arpita Shah, Ada Silvestri, and Ingrid Pollard, amongst others, being previous residents of the program. For me, Fireflies is a very courageous body of work to present yourself and your most cherished relationship to the camera, to lay bare your trauma, your history with such passion and dignity takes a lot of strength and resilience. And throughout all of Polomy's previous works, we see a common thread that runs through, in which agency, voice, and body are used as aids in visual storytelling, to speak and to gesture, all of which reflects this very sense of advocacy and activism that roots her practice. The work in the exhibition creates a unique intersection between art and information. You are urged to slow down, you are urged to look deeper and closer, and it requires you to make connections between the photographs and the moving image works. By devising an enclave with these sculptural yet ephemeral works suspended from the ceiling, these mimic the portals to experience the dualities that she's trying to communicate through her work. And by presenting the two videos split across the space, across the gallery space, one of which is a science fiction shot in which Polomy devises an otherworldly realm, which is about freedom and transcendence, whereas the corresponding film, which you actually see a shot of in this particular installation image, is about sees Polomy performing the sense of being trapped in a void. She's really keen to evoke the feeling of what it's like to be confined, and very much speaks to an accumulation of emotion and states of being that she has experienced throughout her life. Being able to move in and out of these spaces, you're moving through realms of reality, fantasy, and the undercurrents of dystopian reality. They all become entwined and imbue a narrative that cannot be put into words. It's a landscape that is ambivalent and can move across time and space. The exhibition is on at Autograph until the 4th of June, and we will soon be publishing an extended artist-curator conversation for our blog that delves further into the themes in this work. Thank you so much.
Do we move on straight to me? Yes?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, okay. Wonderful. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see if that works. One second. Okay. I'm hoping and just assuming that we're fine and that this works. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here and wonderful to be spending this evening with you all in such wonderful company. And thank you to the audience. And of course, thank you to Melanie and Amanda and all of the organizers to make this happen. My name is Renée Mussai. I'm the senior curator at Autograph, a scholar, writer, and various other things. And I'm actually really grateful, Bindi, that you've already given such a wonderful introduction to Autograph and taken us into our gallery space with Polomy Basu's show. So I'm not going to repeat any of this. And I'm also going to do a slightly wild 10-minute excursion through various moments, if you will. Autograph has been in existence for over 35 years, probably 35 years by now. We were established in the late 1980s by a collective of artists and visual activists, curators from different cultural backgrounds. And the kind of, the very notion of visual activism has always been in the center and at the core of what we do. And for us and for me, exhibition making is really a kind of creative, generative doing activity. It's always dialogical and it's always activist at its core. And it's crucially, this is really a site of evidence, but also a site of inquiry and a site of advocacy, if you will. And it's an opportunity for us and for me, and always has been, to enable us to showcase the work of visionary and often represented artists and foreground those artistic voices that are still too often marginalized. For me personally, this is always artists who are either non-binary, queer, from the African diaspora, female especially, and basically those who are forged from different various registers of difference, if you will. And who use their practice to raise awareness for important sociocultural thematics, who use the power of photography in order to make a difference, if you will. And that includes artists like Lola Flash, who's been doing this visual activism and this sort of queer visual activism for 30 years, somebody like Renée Mussai, one of the most foremost visual activists and photographers who've come out of South Africa, or conceptual artists like Lina Iris Victor. I'm showing this image on screen right now. This was a moment in about, I think, 2019 or so at Autograph, where we've had these 3 exhibitions, and Maxine Walker's work was also shown here. And I'm saying this because for the last 30 years, we've always foregrounded the voices of non-binary and female and queer photographers. So it's very much part of the DNA of what we do at Autograph. At the moment, Pulomi Basu and Sutupa Biswas are on display, and that will be followed by an exhibition by Monica de Miranda and Sasha Huber. So just to say that one of the key things that I wanted to touch upon in this conversation is that sustained dialogue and that sustained sense of investment and advocacy, and to have these long-term intimate conversations that help and amplify those voices. And at the core of this, and this comes really from a space of a profoundly personal, political, a deeply feminist, and what I would call a decolonial, remedial mode of curatorial care work. There isn't enough time to unpack this in a lot of detail, but I'm happy to return to it later. And that sense of imagining a different mode of being and seeing. And I often refer to this as a kind of curatorial otherwise. And otherwise is, and that also, it's both, it's an otherwise, it's an imagining, but it's also a kind of practicing of a certain kind of refusing of being framed in certain sub-histories, framed as a different other voice in opposition to something else. So it's really about activating that kind of power and that sense of also disrupting what has often been traditionally a kind of white cube space. And I mean that in a kind of literal sense. Also, one of my favorite things to do curatorially is to simply paint galleries black in order to kind of deilluminate and disrupt that sense of literal whiteness that often still permeates the art world, if you will. So I'm interested in that disrupting power that photography has, and that disrupting power that art and activism have. And really at the core of that is also a sense of responsibility. And I mean that in the way that Toni Morrison talks about responsibility with the ability, and our ability to respond at the heart of this way of working, if you will. I'm going to try in those 7 minutes that I've got left to just introduce you to some artists who might be more familiar to our audiences and some who are not so familiar yet, I presume, but who work within that space of visual activism. On screen right now, we see an installation we had at Autograph in 2017 of Renée Mussai's incredibly powerful body of self-portraits called Somnyama Gonyama, Hail the Dark Lioness. There are by now hundreds in the archive. This is an exhibition that toured to 12 venues over the last 5 years. And again, that's partly what I mean by that sustained mode of working with artists, and also working very intimately with artists. So this is about long-term relationships that we build curatorially, if you will. I have one of the things that I do as part of my curatorial practice to amplify those voices is to often be in dialogue, whether that's writing and in conversation in dialogue with artists, or whether it's writing and thinking with them through letters. And for instance, when Mussai's exhibition was at the Tate, I wrote one, I think the third letter as part of that. And in that letter, I tried to think with and think rather than think about, think with the artist, think with their visual activism. And this particular letter otherwise. And one of the questions that I asked Mussai here was, what might the notion of otherwise connote in relation to your practice, your living, growing archive of visual activism? I could go on further, but I know that there isn't much time. But what I really want to say is something about that sense of imaginative, remedial, generative sites of defiance that these non-binary and female photographers create through their practice, and that sense of giving space to breathe, giving us space to breathe through their visual activism. These images were taken virtually where I'm sitting right now in my living room. Mussai is inhabiting, embodying my clothes as part of those self-portraits that they are creating. And that body of self-portraits also relates back to one of the things that I'm hoping we can talk about a little bit more in our conversation in a moment, that sense of creating, of doing something within photography that shifts paradigms, if you will. And this body of work has shifted a paradigm around making self-portraiture, making Black, non-binary, queer self-portraiture a mode of socially engaged work that speaks to so many other conversations outside and beyond the personal. And there's incredible courage in creating that kind of work. Incredible courage to use photography to show that one exists, to resist and to persist, to face the camera and to write yourself into certain visual dialogues. And that body of work is dedicated to Moholy's mother, Vesta, who was a domestic servant for 42 years during apartheid in South Africa. So there's another incredibly important feminitude story embedded within this work. And Moholy is also an activist who uses their work to advocate the voices and support the voices of other female, queer, non-binary figures. And here, for instance, we collaborated on a project called the Women's Mobile Museum, which was staged for a year in Philadelphia and included 10 women in addition to their own work being developed and shown. We at Photograph like to commission artists to produce new bodies of work. That sort of like sense of creating and making and opening new dialogues is always at the core of what we do. And on screen here, you see one of our 2017 commissions that we did with Moholy. And the image on the, I'm terrible with left and right, the image on the left side also is a reference to the 1956 March on Pretoria, where women from all sorts of different cultural backgrounds came together to protest against apartheid regimes and the lack of freedom to move freely, if you will, as a Black, brown, or colored person. And one of the things that is incredible for me to see is when that activist work breaks out of certain confines. This image here is at the Venice Biennial a few years ago, and to see Moholy's large-scale self-portraits in all of those different public spaces continuously with their intense gaze beckoning us to recognize them, to recognize their face, to be, see, think with them, means that it is that kind of paradigm shift that I'm talking about. And it's that sense of liberation, reclamation, occupation of spaces through engendering that photographic power that we're talking about. It's a kind of visual reckoning, and each and every image in that series is a conversation around human rights, around social injustices, around the Black body, around femininity, around queerness, around sexuality. Again, the exhibition at the Tate was incredible, and it happened. It will come back in a few years, but at the same time, we also must remember that it's quite something that this is 2022, and it's the first time that a major institution like the Tate dedicates their space to a Black, non-binary, female, African, queer figure in that way. So this is 2022, things are changing, which I'm very happy to see. Publishing is very important, of course, because that's the legacy of the work. When we, which lives beyond exhibitions, when we showed Moholy's work, we also commissioned 18, I think almost 18 texts to invite scholars to respond to the work, and that was published and later also part of the award-winning monograph which Aperture produced. So I'm moving on very quickly because I know I only have a few minutes left. From somebody like, so Moholy, of course, is a very well-known, celebrated visual activist in that sense. And in this particular work here, for instance, they speak about bodies lost at sea. I mentioned earlier as part of a kind of, the migration crisis, etc. I mentioned earlier that each and every one of these self-portraits is not just a personal exploration of identity. It speaks to social injustices. And here there's one example of that in relation to migration and the kind of trauma around that, and having to look for their body in relation to bodies that might have never made it to the end of their journey. This brings me to another artist, Ada Silvestri, a very close friend, brilliant visual activist, committed artist, and somebody whose work is not as well known as Moholy, but who works within a similar register of visual activism. Here, in this particular body of work, they look at the trauma of she. Sorry, I've moved from Moholy's pronoun to Ada now. Ada, she looks at, in the series called Even This Will Pass, she looks at the trauma of human trafficking and telling the story and amplifying the voices of those who survived, especially crossing to the UK from Eritrea. They're incredibly rich photographic pieces, very ingeniously composed in the sense that they protect the figures, the participants' identities, and then sutured with thread on top of the image, literally broken into the surface of the image, is their journey, if you will. So the question here is also freedom, but at what cost? This is a body of work that Ada produced just when she was finishing college in 2013. After that, she followed with another incredibly hard-hitting, incredibly powerful and potent body of work, which we exhibited at Autograph. I had the great pleasure to curate in 2016, I believe it was, called Unsterile Clinic. And in Unsterile Clinic, Ada very courageously looks at the globally widespread practice of FGM, which stands for female genital mutilation, and look at that sense of lack of agency and voice, and what we can do in order to raise awareness for gender-based violence and discrimination against girls and women. So what I'm trying to say here is really that sense of commitment, that incredible sense of commitment and care to amplifying those voices who are often marginalized, and often also artworks that are not easily shown in galleries and that are not easy for artists to produce, who work within that personal and political register. And then a third body of work by Ada Silvestri, her most recent body of work, which we commissioned at Autograph as part of our latest project, latest big commissioning project called Care, Contagion, Community, Self and Other. And this was done during the lockdowns. And here Ada was creating a very powerful, compelling critique to look at the devastating impact of COVID-19 on frontline workers of colors, and again, ingeniously using a certain mode of action painting on top of her photographic surfaces in order to create that sense of contagion, and this to create and amplify that sense of contagion and disease. And what she's doing here is also asking us to look very carefully at each of those layered images. And within the various layers, we read, for example, if we look carefully enough, we can see the names of frontline workers who have sadly lost their lives during the COVID pandemic, written into the embedded within the image. And again, that sense of that sense of systematic inequality, systematic racism, institutional racism, and societal injustices are expressed within that visual activism core of the work. And this is the Care, Contagion, Community, Self, another publication that we produced with Sylvia Rossi, another brilliant artist and visual activist, on the cover. Now, in the last minute that I hope I still have, I'm going to just very quickly say something else about this sense of remedial curatorial care, and that sense of looking carefully. Whilst a lot of our time is invested in supporting and working with contemporary artists, of course, there's also the importance of looking into the archive and unearthing images and narratives that speak both to diasporic, Afro-diasporic conversations, those missing chapters that are often not part of a kind of wider cultural narratives, but it's also about amplifying those female presences that are part of this lineage, if you will. And here, for example, this was one of the images that for me inspired our Black Chronicles image, our Black Chronicles curatorial project around Victorian Black presences. And here we've got in 1872, a young African woman facing the camera with such elegance, such poise, and such incredible disruptive power, if you will, if you think about that within a sort of Victorian visuality that often did not have space or include or amplify the presence of Black female, African, or other Black presences, if you will. So that's all that is part of the curatorial care work that I'm talking about. And then giving that same, sharing that knowledge and sharing that sense of engagement with emergent artists to respond to the archive and to produce new work as part of that conversation. And here, this is an artist commission from 2016, Heather Japong, who used the image of Sarah Forbes-Burnett as an inspiration to create her own self-portraiture, where she inhabits that figure, that archival presence, if you will, but then also disrupting it with her Doc Martens boots and then very sort of like contemporary signifiers, if you will. So again, it's for us, that's a way of supporting artists and voices whilst continuing to do the work that we do. I don't have time on this, but I'm going to just quickly show those images whilst I move on. This is part of the Black Chronicles project. I mentioned Sarah Forbes-Burnett's images large-scale poster in the show. Reason for that is also because every missing chapter that we talk about invites another missing chapter. So for us, when we were researching Black presences in the Victorian era, the missing chapter within that was both Black female photographers, but also the kind of like small amount of Black women who were represented within those images. So then there's a way curatorially to amplify that. And here are just some other figures as part of this project. And in the center of it, you see, for example, an early pioneer of women's rights in South Africa who was photographed in London in the late 1800s, Charlotte Manye Maxeke. And here, those same images projected into the public sphere. Underneath, if you can see, there's a graffiti of Mary Wollstonecraft, and this is the archive injected into public spaces in order to open up access. And these were all images of female figures within the 19th century at a place in Stoke Newington in North London, which was seen as the birthplace of feminism. And that's where Mary Wollstonecraft drafted one of her first feminist manifestos. So just in closing, I guess what I want to say is that sense of curatorial labor, that emotional visual labor towards visual justice and equity, collaborative journeys of excavation, and excavation that also thinks and speaks about the kind of those eyes that are in the archive, those eyes that make curatorial, scholarly, artistic inquiries, what kinds of eyes are behind and in front of the camera, what eyes make those inquiries, and that sense of responsibility towards a kind of like inherently in my case, feminist mode of working with photography that foregrounds a curatorial praxis and an ethics of care. And I will stop here with Moholi's wonderful image called Bayepi 3, which asks us where all of those women who protested in 1956 in South Africa, where they are now. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing. I'm not sure what happens next. Yes, I stop. Okay.
Sorry, I've got a funny green color. I've put the lamp on because it's got dark. So thank you to NMWA for hosting this, and it's wonderful to be in such wonderful company. I'd like to start with a very short film that sums up 100 Heroines. Next slide, please.
When you truly find a project that you believe in.
People can learn about women and non-binary photographers from all over the world.
It's important that educational resources like these are not only used for a month. We can help open up possibilities for the future.
And keep pushing that boundary and amplifying those women's voices.
Women have been working in photography since the 1800s, and I think more people should know.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So this evening, I'm going to focus on how we're sharing women's stories. So if you go to the next and the next one, please. So starting with the Heroines Past, we became independent just before COVID hit. So one of the first things we had to do was find a way of working online. And this is typical of the sort of gallery that we do. We were part of Exposure Photography Festival. And if you could go to the next slide, please. And that should run automatically. So we built these virtual galleries around 7 historical heroines. And they were interactive. People could move about them how they wanted, and there were accompanying texts and so on. So then we come on to the heroines present. Again, we were looking for different ways during COVID or during lockdown of how to take the work out into the public. And we did part of Kensington and Chelsea Arts Festival. We took work onto the telephone boxes in Kensington and Chelsea. And again, on the website, if you move on to the next slide, there was a gallery dedicated to Tessa's work with, again, texts talking about where she got her inspiration from and how she created the images. These are food, or the one that you saw on the phone box was a food collage that she made out of different parts of salad. So she had to make it really quickly to stop the salad wilting. The next slide, please. So as we emerged from lockdown, we had our first physical show, curated by Zelda, who I believe is in the audience tonight. And this was all about trying to engage people by telling the heroine stories through objects. And so here we see Polly Braden's Power Ranger, and some things from Jane Hilton's work with working girls in Nevada, including some nipple tassels that one of the girls had made especially for Jane. Next one. Here we see a document from one of the historical heroines when the Nazis confiscated their belongings in Vienna. This was the paper given to them. And on the right is a picture from Monica Alcazar Duarte, who's currently got an installation in our studio. And we find that when people come in, particularly school groups, they really engage with the objects, and through those, they start to understand the heroine's stories and the work they do. We're currently looking for a heroine who works with trains. This seems to be the complaint from the young boys, that we haven't got enough trains around our space. Right, if you could move on to the next one. So another way we responded to lockdown was to have a film festival every Thursday night. And this was curated by Liesl Ponga. And it was a short program of films made by or about women. And all the films came from YouTube and Vimeo. And we've got an example on the next slide, a short clip from one, which was by one of our other heroines, Katie Grannon. If we could play that, please.
1, 2, 3.
Imagine a place, serene, tranquil, and peaceful. A place of weightlessness, a world as old as time and as new as a dream.
I saw on Facebook somebody said mermaids aren't real. I am a mermaid, my daughter's a mermaid, and my granddaughter's a mermaid, so like, take that.
That film was particularly popular. Everybody likes mermaids, and you know, even some of the younger people began to engage with the film night. And if we can move on to the next slide, I'd like to talk about the Heroines Future now. So we've finally opened our first physical space in Gloucester, and we're trying out a few programs to how to engage particularly women with photography, and how we can help and support them to be the heroines of tomorrow. And this is a project we're doing called Gloucesterama. If you can move on to the next slide. So we're asking people in Gloucester to photograph every street, and we're creating a living archive. Gloucester's undergoing a massive regeneration, so it's really timely to be doing this at the moment, because we're seeing the streets change on a daily basis. And we did a similar project in London in 2014, and it's based on the novel by Jeff Nicholson, where a guy walks every street in London. And we did it, 1,700 of us. So Gloucester has got 2,000 streets, and we've got a lot of groups out there photographing them. And we've got some pictures on the next slide of what's coming in. And already we're beginning to get a lovely build-up of different aspects of Gloucester. And it's quite touching that people who have lived here for years and years are saying, oh, I never knew that, you know, this was there, or these places existed. So we're sort of uncovering secret Gloucester as well. And we're tying this back to the work of the existing contemporary heroines with talks. They've been online. So Polly Braden was sharing her square mile work, talking about how to photograph the streets and the people. Yan Wang Preston was telling us how she uses mapping as a method and mapping the landscape. And again, people are engaging far more with the heroines' work by actually having the chance to hear them talk and relate it to their own photography. And the next slide, please. So we launched a new project on International Women's Day. This work here is Alina Brotheris in front of the Millicent Fawcett statue in Parliament Square. And we actually commissioned this. This photograph was taken about 2 years and a week ago today, ready for an exhibition before COVID struck, and then nothing actually happened. So I was thrilled when Alina contacted me recently and said that she would be using it for posters for an exhibition. So Alina's work is based very much on event scores, and we use those a lot in the studio. And because this was based on Alina, based on Gillian Waring, we decided to devise our own project from this, which is 100 women in Gloucester are photographing 100 heroines from Gloucester. And the heroines are being nominated. If you go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, that was the blurb about the Alina's project, but moving to this, I've jumped ahead a bit. If you move to the next one. So we've had nominations for the Bishop, a woman who runs a community radio station, a performer and musician, one of the young girls who is the host at the co-working space. She's a young artist. The mayor, and Gloucester is extraordinary that the mayor, the sheriff, the lieutenant, the bishop, they're all women. So this led us to then respond to another event score, which is from Dorothee Richter at the Zurich University of Arts. And it was to hold a secret feminist meeting, which we duly did. And the next slide shows our dinner, where we were all wearing these, which are Mary Hogue masks. And this was a body of work. She had her own photographic studio in Norway. Oops, sorry, my time is up. But I think it was the 70s, a whole load of her work that she did with her partner. They were found on glass slides in a barn, and they showed a very different side to her work, playing with gender identity and so on, which, you know, for the 1870s was quite something. So we start where we finish, in the archive. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be able to engage in this discussion tonight. My name is Shoair Mavlian. I'm the director of Photoworks. Photoworks is a not-for-profit charity founded in 1995. So we've been running for around 25 years. And we have a national remit, and our role is to champion photography across the UK. We don't have a building, and instead we partner with lots of museums or non-arts organizations around the world, and we have a truly international program, so working with artists not just based in the UK but around the world. I took over as director in 2018, and since then I've been leading on the strategic vision and artistic direction of the organization. And part of my vision is to champion women in photography. So Photoworks doesn't have a specific program dedicated to women in photography, but we do make sure that women are represented throughout our program. And for me, what this means is more than a 50-50 gender split in our program, actually. So based on the fact that 80% of visual arts and photography graduates in the UK are women, this means, and primarily Photoworks works with early career and mid-career photographers. So for me, as a director of a photography organization working with artists at the beginnings of their career, it's really important that our program reflects what's happening, what's coming out of the education system, and what's kind of happening in the cultural sector at large. So we don't have, we never publicly say that our program is 80% women, but we do make sure that there is a big kind of push towards the representation of women throughout Photoworks program. I'm going to quickly talk to you about a few of our kind of big opportunities and big programs that we run. So the first being the Jerwood Photoworks Awards. So Photoworks program in general is really based on opportunities for artists. We don't have a collection. So instead of spending money on building a collection, we spend money on helping artists make new work. So we do a lot of new commissions and a lot of really transformative new commissions. So the work on screen now is a commission we did in 2020 for the Jerwood Photoworks Awards. It's a work by Silvia Rossi. And if we can go to the next slide, we can see the full exhibition of this. Sylvia was able to create a new body of work. She received a substantial artist fee, a production budget, mentoring support, and organizational support, where we produced an exhibition, and it toured internationally around Europe. And this work is kind of a really important example of how Photoworks invests in women photographers and women artists really early on in their career, to be able to enable a step change and really to be able to enable them to make that breakthrough body of work that then hopefully really takes their career to the next level. And this series Encounter is really something that has led to multiple other opportunities for Sylvia, which is fantastic. It's exactly what the program should do, and it's exactly what our new commissions should do. And then just moving on to the next program I wanted to talk about, which is our Photoworks Festival. So a big part of Photoworks program is the Photoworks Festival. And during the pandemic, it really forced us to rethink what a photography festival is. And a lot of what we've been doing at Photoworks since I took over 4 years ago is really kind of challenging and rethinking the structures that exist in the art world, how we make exhibitions, how we make photography festivals. And really starting from the point that primarily all of these structures that we have been trained to work within were developed by men in the West, primarily white men, and really trying to challenge who they serve and rethink who those kind of structures serve. So for the Photoworks Festival in 2020, we rethought the festival model. And we deconstructed the festival, and the theme of the festival was propositions for alternative narratives. So we were conceptually rethinking what alternative histories of photography look like, but we were also conceptually rethinking the physical structure of a photography festival. So if we move to the next slide, you will see that we made a portable festival. So a festival which included 11 artists from around the world, international artists, that was packed down into a portable box that was posted around the world. So instead of you traveling to the festival traveled to you. It encroached into your domestic space or your community space or your school space or university space. And we were essentially trying to challenge this idea of the structure of a photography festival, but also the power of a curator within a gallery or museum context. So instead of the curators organizing the festival and hanging the festival, the audience got to become the curator and install the festival at home. So really kind of playing with this idea of power dynamics. And if we move through, Amanda, if we move through these next slides quite quickly, I'll just talk a little bit about each of the artists. So the Festival in a Box included 11 artists, 8 of those artists were women, but we never kind of publicly made that a statement. We always just kind of under the radar make sure that we are constantly promoting and giving women opportunities. So this is an installation shot of the festival all unpacked and installed, but obviously there's lots of different variations of how it can be installed. The artists included kind of a list of amazing international artists. So if we just move through these slides, I'll just name them. So Ronan McKenzie, an incredible young fashion photographer from London, really doing incredible things. She's actually opened her own artist-run space as well called Home, working kind of in this crossover between fashion photography and contemporary art. Pixie Lau, Chinese photographer based in Brooklyn, this incredible body of work about the power balance between her and her boyfriend. Farah Al-Qasimi, an artist born in the UAE but who lives in Brooklyn, really kind of making work about growing up in the UAE and those kind of cultural nuances. Alberta Whittle, a Scottish Barbadian artist, works a lot in performance and really about this liminal space between kind of new surrealism. And then Palomi Basu, who we spoke about earlier this evening. We featured her work Centralia, an award-winning photo book. And Sethambili Mesansen, South African photographer, really working on this crossover between performance and photography, so putting herself in the frame. And actually in quite a few of these artists' work, they put themselves in front of the camera as well as behind it. The French artist Alex Marie, mixing photography and sculpture, so really allowing artists to experiment and move photography beyond the framed image. And then finally, Lottie Anderson, another British artist that works a lot with conceptual photography and live events. So just wanting to highlight those 8 women photographers that were part of the festival. We also had 3 men who also made incredible contributions, Guan Yu Zhu, Roger Eberhard, and the last artist, Ivars Gravlej. So you can see really there was a big skew between giving women the profile, but also a really important point of the Festival in a Box was this idea of not having a lead artist. So really flattening the hierarchy between all of the artists involved in the festival. We actually took the decision to select all of the artists from the same generation so that there wasn't this imbalance of people that had had a longer career or more public profile. We really tried to put everyone on a level playing field. And then, of course, the Festival in a Box was made to be used, and it was made to really be experimented with. So there's just a few images here of how the Festival in a Box was used by schools and universities. This is University of the Arts, London. And then I think we have a few images from some high schools, Eastbourne College, RA School for Girls, RN School for Girls. And then some people really took it outdoors and took the experimentation to another level. So really, as curators and the artists that were involved, they really had to let go of that idea of hierarchy. And then finally, just the last thing I wanted to highlight was that the majority of the work we do is focused on early and mid-career artists. So we categorize that as artists in the first 15 to 20 years of their career. But we do occasionally work with artists that are much more senior, that have been overlooked. So when we have the opportunity, when we find the opportunity, we really try and focus on women who have been overlooked. So we did a solo show in 2019 of a German artist, Ursula Schultz-Dornberg. She began to get recognition in her early 80s. So had been making work for 50 years, incredible practice, incredible kind of conceptual rigor behind her work, but had never really had the museum shows that she deserved. So this was her first solo museum show in France at the MEP in Paris. And then we also took that work outdoors and had outdoor displays of her work around the metro stations in Paris. So really kind of making sure that we don't forget artists that have been overlooked and you know, not always focusing on early and mid-career, making sure that we come back and catch the people that slip through the net. And I think I'll end it there so we can start the discussion.
Thank you all for your presentations. These were absolutely amazing and informative, and I'm really excited about the conversation and hoping that you all will allow us to, we talked about stretching, we have some questions, but there's one thing that came up in the conversation a lot between everyone's work was the archives. And I'm also noticing in conversations with women artists and non-binary artists in the States, a lot of people are redefining and shifting how the archives are used, how they're created, how they're being contributed to. I would love to hear you all speak more about either any phase of the archives, questioning it from where it was before, publishing. I love the sign where the woman has up says, no woman has ever written enough. And I also love what, Renee, that you had to speak about the importance of publishing. Tell us more about women and artists' relationship to the archives and how that can shift and right the balance with our voices.
I respond briefly to begin with. I think I think first of all, I think the key thing here is, there's so much to say about that, but the archive as a kind of living, breathing space of inquiry, to see it as a space that isn't dead or in the past, something to be activated. And I think that is what a lot of the artists that we're talking about do, and what we also do as scholars and curators, and to extract knowledge from the archive, if you will, to help us and ground us in the presence. And that's about, presence in terms of visibility, in terms of lineage, if you will, but also in terms of just seeing the past in the archive as something to help us imagine different possible futures. But at the same time also tracing and probing and approaching the archive as something to be refused and reinvented and reimagined. I think those are really important things, because, for example, if we look at Renée Musai's work, a lot of, or somebody like Heroines Future, who I didn't speak about, but showed very briefly at the beginning, their work is also looking at those complicated and complex histories, especially around, myths around the African continent in Heroines Future's case, for example, or with Renée Musai, in terms of the kind of violence that sits within the archive, but using it as a generative space to imagine otherwise, if you will. So I think that's really important. There's also something to be said about how specifically within Black feminist scholarship in the last few years, and I'm thinking here of incredible scholars and writers like Saidiya Hartman, Tina Camp, Christina Sharp, how they activate the archive as this space to imagine otherwise, to extract stories in a kind of speculative, imaginative, loving, embodied way and mode, and to do different work, if you do, with that images. So that's one thing. And then the publishing aspect, of course, I think it's really crucial. Exhibitions, they disappear. It's wonderful to stage exhibitions as these sites of inquiry and transformative, informative encounters. But what's really important is to cement those presences through publishing, through those physical objects that end up as citable pieces in, say, the British Library or elsewhere, that can then flow into curriculums, into a kind of like, decolonizing drive within the curriculum as well, where we can cite those artists, where we can make those presences citable and long-term. So one of the things that we try and do, and it's not always possible due to finances or funding at Autograph, but it really, when we can publish at the same time, that's when the work has a sort of like legacy in a different way. So with Renée Mussai, we published one of our broadsheet newspapers. We made it a triple issue. We commissioned, what did I say? I can't remember now. I think 16 new texts to contextualize and to create a kind of like scholarly, activist, poetic spin to hold those images. With Heroines Future, we published her first proper hardcover monograph, and again invited those crucial voices like Christina Sharp into the conversation. And we published a sort of like 12,000 word in conversation over 3 years between the artist and myself in that. We publish on our online blogs. So Bindi, for example, was talking briefly about her conversations with Pulomi Basu. And again, that's about amplifying the artist's voices, both about amplifying them, but also cementing them within a kind of written repertoire and a lexicon that will, outlive us all, if you will. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's one response, I guess, to that. If that's helpful.
Oh, it's quite helpful. And I think it opens up for anyone else to speak on it, because it is this thread that seems to go through everyone's conversation that they in their presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're important for helping put the record straight, that women have been pioneers since the inception of photography. The first woman who photographed, the first photographer to make images of the moon was a woman. and a lot of them had to hide their, particularly commercially, that they couldn't have their names assigned to their work because they weren't allowed to. So their husbands took a lot of the credit. And I think it's really good now that we can go back and attribute it to the right photographers.
Yeah, and I think we're beginning to see quite a few like anthologies on women in photography being published recently. There was a huge book published in French last year, 300 women photographers, and a few other smaller kind of anthologies last year as well. So really we can begin to see that kind of uncovering being done in publishing now. I personally would like to see it be done more in a more integrated way as well, just republishing the history of photography with more women in general. So that's the kind of approach that we are taking at Photoworks.
There's something to be said around that notion of publishing as well. And I hear you and I agree with you completely. But one of the things I was sort of insinuating in my presentation as well is that whenever this work that we do is a continuous work. And every time we talk about, writing some bits and some missing chapters, it always invites another. So for example, I was really pleased to see the Feminist History of Photography, which Emma Lewis published recently, to be very diverse and very inclusive. The Global History of Photography book in relation to women that you mentioned, Shoair, looks like it's also an incredibly inclusive volume. But at the same time, we must remember that only a couple of years ago, Thames and Hudson published a 3-part photophile series, which was all about pioneering revolutionary women photographers in 3 parts. And out of those, I can't remember how many, but let's say there were 80 photographers, female photographers within that. About 5 of them were from different cultural backgrounds, and that was 2020. So to me, that just shows us how much work we still have to do. So things are changing, but it's an ongoing, continuous generative mode of working that we all have to engage with. And to me also, when there was, for example, I can't remember now what it was called, A History of Women Photographers, that I think was published in 1994 by Naomi Rosenblum. I might be getting it wrong, I hope I'm not. But again, it's a giant volume. I was reviewing it the other day. There was virtually not a single Black or brown photographer or queer photographer within that volume. And that is at a time when books like Viewfinders were already in circulation, which was specifically about Black women's practice. And only a few years ago, 2 brilliant photographers, artists, one of them I think spoke on this series before, Adama Delphine Fabundo, and also working together with Leila Byron. They published Phone, but at the time they had to self-publish that book. And we're talking 3 or 4 years ago, because publishers did not see or think that there was a market for this. And it's like I'm working on various publications at the moment that are all to amplify and amplify those female and very much those female Afro-diasporic Black voices. But this is only now happening in many ways. Previously, they were still continuously excluded from those conversations.
I love how that ties in, from my perspective, it ties directly into the work that Bindi is doing as well. When you were talking about your perspective of your experience looking at how the pandemic was unfolding, and you talked about how the world was closing or coming in this push of together, and then also this kind of, how the leaders were acting, but what they were also promoting. And I feel, I want to ask, because you markedly talked about 2020. This was not happening, as you were saying, Renee. And then you're looking at Bindi, I'm looking at Bindi's work, and I'm saying how there's this push. And then now there was all of this, a lot of this innovation, a lot of this push for new voices, a lot of this new modes of curatorial practice that were not accepted before seem to be allowed or pushed or made available during this time period. So Bindi, I wanted to know if you could, to hear you speak about, do you feel any of that is reflected in your work? And then also would love to have anyone comment on it as well.
I guess, for me, working both as an artist and a curator, what was interesting at that moment when the pandemic hit was how things shifted considerably, how the use of technology and a conversation like this could be made possible. And it didn't really matter where you were situated or where you were, but you could still be participating in something. And really, you know, I did quite a few remote portfolio reviews for different organizations over that period. And this was ranging from, you know, Photo Spania to local portfolio reviews in the UK to some that were much, you know, further out. But what was really interesting when I was speaking to the photographers was that a lot of them wouldn't necessarily have had access other than through a kind of Zoom platform beforehand. And I think that shift has been quite interesting and I think really beneficial, because accessing photography, art and culture, you know, in a wider sense is really important. You know, recently I was working with Ada on a project with Fast Forward Women in Photography, and it was a group of amazing LGBTQIA plus women called the Rainbow Sisters. And it was really about showing them how photography can be for visual storytelling and allowing them space to tell their stories. And I think really from that 2020 moment, like Renée is saying, it's like it's shifted, but it's still shifting, and it has to keep shifting, because if it doesn't, we still fall behind and we're not progressing. Yes, there's more recognition for women in the arts and women in photography, which is phenomenal, and I think that's already come on leaps and bounds, but there's still so much more work to be done.
And I think often it is, and I think, Bindi, it's often practicing artists like yourself who are also pushing that work and pushing that work for other photographers at the same time, which I think is so extraordinary too, in the same way that, as you know, Joy Gregory is working on a new book which she's editing called Shining Lights, which is all about Black women's practice in the 1980s and 90s to unearth those missing chapters, if you will. And that's Joy Gregory herself, of course, is one of the pioneering Black female artists working in the UK, in a UK context, since the 1980s. It's the first artist we commissioned at Autograph to also create a series of self-portraits. So I think it's incredible and wonderful and beautiful. And what I was also trying to say with M. Fawn, that it is female practicing artists who are pushing for advocacy and for recognition of other artists. Similarly with NMWA and the Women's Mobile Museum, it's that sort of like that sense of solidarity and, you know, making space and holding space and working with and for each other.
Yeah. I think there's also something kind of interesting in the context of, you know, audiences often look to big museums and big publishers and like big mainstream names. But a lot of the smaller organizations are run by women, and you know, that's where we really have the power. I worked at Tate for 10 years. I had very little agency over what I could program. I'm now the director of a relatively small photography organization, but I have absolute agency over what I'm able to program. And that's something that's really amazing. So, and there's lots of organizations, smaller organizations around the UK and internationally, where women are in positions of power. So from an audience perspective, to kind of look beyond the big museums and support smaller, more grassroots organizations who are doing that really kind of slow, important work.
And that difference, Shoair, that you've made for an artist like Sylvia Rossi at those crucial points in their careers, when a grant like the Photoworks, a Sherwood grant that you have given her is utterly transformative for their practice at that particular point, that is really where you make that difference for an artist. It's wonderful.
Del, in our conversation before, you were speaking about just how those kind of grants that Shoair's organization is able to give, and also what Renée was just speaking about, it makes a huge difference on how a person who is in their everyday life able to break through and have access to technology. So first, I would love to hear you speak about just the difference that can make in a small organization or a person who is less known to have that kind of support, and what kind of support should be available to this talent that is often hidden in spaces?
There should be far more grants along the Jerwood type grant, which is absolutely fantastic, and as Shoair says, completely transformative to artists. In our pre-discussion, we were talking about how many young artists we know who sort of have to do 3 jobs to survive, and particularly if they've got a young child, they're trying to cope with childcare, and it ends up that the only time they have to develop their practice is a Saturday afternoon or something, and even then they might have children around them. So these grants need to be really meaningful so that women do have the chance to develop their practice without worrying about having to stack the shelves in a supermarket or something.
I think it makes a huge difference, and across any field, a lot of talent is held up by the day-to-day life and the meeting day-to-day needs, unfortunately, in this society for a lot of people. I would also love to hear you talk about, because everyone also has mentioned how the technology shifted during the pandemic. So what I noticed is that before the pandemic, there was no accessibility to computers. When we talked about schools and we couldn't find money for this, we couldn't find money for that. The pandemic happens, everybody's sent home with a computer, everything shifted, and now all of these things are possible. What I also noticed in the art field is that, oh, this kind of program wouldn't be acceptable. That kind of curatorial practice is not art or fine art. And then when the pandemic hit and no one knew what to do, a lot of practices, particularly practices from women and non-binary artists, became acceptable. So I love to hear, my concern is what happens when we shift out of this pandemic and people try to rush back into what it is? What can we do to make sure that these practices, that this technology is not left behind? Because I do feel like it's this moment that has amplified these voices.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. I think we should be really trying our best to protect all of the innovation and experimentation that's happened during the pandemic and not to go back to the way we were, particularly in terms of the kind of structures and hierarchies of big museums. And I guess something kind of really interesting around, I think what will happen and what we are yet to see is, are the audiences going to return and want the same type of programming? And that relationship between what the audience demands, I think really will play a crucial role in how we are able to continue to support women and marginalized communities in the visual arts and continue to give them a profile. And I think what the pandemic showed is that, you know, some of that power has been shifted to audiences. So as a consumer of culture, you're not just a passive consumer anymore. What do you want to see? Who do you want to support? What kind of artists do you want to support? What kind of programming do you want to support? And I think that's a question that that audiences should be asking themselves, as well as curators and museums.
I think that's the right point. I think audiences do have a lot more power than perhaps we even thought they had before. And I think that's a really important thing, especially around accessibility. So I think, I know Renee briefly spoke about our commissioning program, Care Contagion Community. It was actually not conceptualized as an exhibition until much later. The main premise was to commission 10 artists, but share their work online for our audiences to experience. And then much later, actually, once we had, I think, launched all of the 10 artists' work, we then thought, actually, this can make a really strong exhibition because the portfolio of works that were made were actually coming into the collection anyway. So it was about making sure that all the texts that were published in the book, all the artist-curator conversations, all of the works were actually they're all online. So you don't necessarily, if you don't have the means to buy the book, you can still have that access. And I think that's what's become quite important in terms of our digital programming. And I think will continue to become quite crucial as we move forward. And so the artist conversations, I mentioned one with Polomy, are really important. So, not just about artists who we are working with on exhibitions, but also artists who are interested in hearing their voices. So from Mariam Wahid to Toby Alexandra Falade to Monica Alcazar Duarte, these are all really important artists. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an exhibition attached to each of those things, but it's just about hearing their voices, hearing their stories, what makes their practice really important. And I think sharing that conversation from just a kind of, a one-on-one type situation where you're talking to an artist, but sharing it with our audiences, I think makes it incredibly special to understand what we're interested in, what they're interested in, and how we can amplify their voices and their work to a much larger constituency of people.
Bindi, I think that's a fascinating point, because I feel the process of curation became less, less violent. And there's something about the ability to connect easy through technology this way, like you said, no matter where you're positioned, that I feel like it made it more possible for a more collaborative style of curatorial practice that includes reaching out to artists, reaching out to archaeologists, historians, like Renee, you're talking about reaching out to Christina Sharp, and Del, you were talking about highlighting photographers that were archaeologists as well. And I think it made it more possible. So my question is, when that kind of care, would you say that in your experience that you had more opportunity to bring that innovation and care in these last 2 years? Or did you notice a shift in how you were being called on as women artists and women curators to do this kind of thinking and this kind of emotional labor to take these institutions through this pandemic time? Were you being called on to do that work? And how did that make a difference for you? Or what did that do for you?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things that kind of collided during that time as well. So we have to remember that this pandemic, there's, Black Lives Matter movements reignited through the various things the tragic things that have happened during that time, and the way that institutions, and especially, cultural institutions as well, started to very kind of like, they were sort of forced critically to look at themselves in a way that they didn't necessarily have to before. So a lot of new opportunities have come across as that, but it also has come with a certain amount of tax, dare I say. So there was a lot of taxing of doing that, emotional, visual and otherwise labor that was also, kind of in many ways disproportionately placed on people of color and women too. And the pandemic, as we know, has affected women and people of color in certain ways that are, even more complex than it was for most people. So there's all of that to consider as well. And the amount of invitations and asks to be on juries, to be on panels, to contribute to things, they have amplified for reasons that, we could look at, in a positive in some ways, but also not necessarily, and have put up, a great amount of tax and stress on us at the same time, whilst also opening doors. So I think we need to look at that in a slightly complex, dialogical and diagonal way, if you will. I think there's been a shift, and I think one of the things that we all, I hope, will not want to do is to go back to how things were before, in inverted commas, that sort of like sense of normal that I don't think was necessarily a normal, in inverted commas, that worked for most of us.
Oh, it was quite abnormal. Let's just call it what it was.
Yes.
It was strange before, yes.
Absolutely. I would look at all of that critically, but it has also created, a renewed sense and a renewed medial sense of solidarity across a lot of spaces. And I do think that there is a connectivity that has opened up, and kind of like an access that wasn't there before, and a mode of working with each other and for each other and alongside each other that's been really generative. and whether that is to do with, with commissioning, with having these conversations, with opening up access to people to enter those dialogues in all sorts of ways. And I think we just need to continue to build on that, to build on those informative, transformative encounters with each other.
If we were in person, this would be the time that we would go for dinner, and we would sit down and have a dinner of 200 people to continue to ask questions from the audience. So even though we're not in person, I am not offended if someone grabs a snack or something, but I want to make sure we have a little bit of time just to answer a few questions from the audience. Renee, what you spoke about with connectivity, I think that's not having the connectivity before was what felt so abnormal, and this rush of connectivity that also was reflected in the work that you're doing, Bindi, I think speaks to it. One question that is from the audience is that one Millie Jackson Rowe would like to know, she says, incredible talks, thank you. Shoair, did you receive any comments or feedback from audiences about the fact that there were more women artists than men artists included in the festival box?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And we didn't actually, and we never do. Our program is heavily skewed towards women. Also around 50% of our program, because we do try and be international. And by that, I mean reflecting the global population. So we have 50% of our artists are people of color. And because we don't explicitly say it and name programs, in very specific terms, we very rarely get challenged on it. So I feel like we're doing the work underneath the surface, and luckily we get away with it.
I hope you continue to. Maria Belsalter, pardon me if I am mispronouncing your names, I do apologize, said, would you say that compared to other countries like the USA, the UK has a different or specific approach to showing and promoting female photographers? Does anyone want to talk about that?
I'm not sure if there's a different approach, but there are quite a few long-standing kind of champions of women photography in the UK. There's the Fast Forward academic group that's been running for over 10 years. There's Firecracker Women in Photography that's been running for over 10 years. I'm sure there's lots of equivalents in the US as well. But there's definitely, I feel like there's definitely a lot of grassroots championing of women in photography in the UK, which does make a difference, actually.
I do think so in some, sorry.
Go ahead, Renee, pardon.
I do think though also in some ways we have a lot of catching up to do with the US too, in terms of acquisitions of women's work, for example, in museums and galleries. I mean, it's interesting that the V&A has just appointed a curator specifically focused on women and photography, and also to help them, acquire more works of women and embed that kind of work into their program. And that's happening now in 2022. I think a lot of a lot of acquisitions that are happening with major museums of these pioneering women that include artists like Ingrid Pollard or Joy Gregory I mentioned earlier, and of course many others, is only just now kind of happening in some ways. I mean, they might have had a few works in collections before, but I think there's a real drive at the moment. And I think the philanthropy that is more present in the US as well, we're lacking in the UK, I think, to help institutions buy more work. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done there. And I think that's part of what we all do as well, is by trying to create opportunities for artists to make new work, to also advocate for that work to then be acquired by major institutions in order to have that long-term legacy within those collections. So I think that's a really important point. And I think there's also something really interesting about dialogues that happen, transnationally as well between artists, and that sense of that sense of solidarity, if you will.
I agree. I think it's quite exciting to see the conversations that are happening across cultures, through countries, and how people are pulling into each other's histories and who's documenting, and it's quite amazing. There's also a call from quite a few people who want to know some of the names that were mentioned. And one, we will have the replay available by the end of next week, so it'll be easier to catch then. And then also, if possible, if you all just have maybe 2 or 3 names that you would want to know. Someone had mentioned a Norwegian photographer, and then also someone wanted to know about Rainbow Sisters, Bindi, if they could find more information on that. Yes, so if you all want to mention that now, just maybe 2 or 3 people that you had mentioned and want to reference.
Yeah, I mean, the Rainbow Sisters are a group of women that are supported by the Women for Refugee Women charity, who support women seeking refuge in the UK. So going through the asylum process, who have either sought asylum or are in the process of seeking asylum. We'll actually be publishing a page about the project very soon. So if you sign up to Autograph's mailing list, you will get a newsletter that will be dedicated to the project. And it's a phenomenal project where there's multiple partners. There's obviously Fast Forward as the overarching steering kind of group, and then you have Impressions Gallery in Bradford, another photography organization as well involved, and the National Galleries of Scotland. So there's quite a few partners involved with that, and each were working with a very rich, diverse set of women and even practitioners that were helping to facilitate, so as artists, educators as well. So yeah, we'll be publishing that page soon, and it'd be very exciting to share that with you all.
I was just going to add to that, Bindi. So Ada Silvestri, who I talked about briefly, is this wonderful, brilliant visual activist and artist. Ada was working closely as the creative artist facilitator on that project. So again, it's also about creating different kinds of opportunities and collaborating in different ways with artists. And I think that's really important. As well, in that sense, that, and equally with Bindi being a practitioner and a curator at the same time, to have Ada Silvestri and Bindi Vora and the Rainbow Sisters, who were all of refugee background and identified as LGBTQI, together working, that's such a potent, wonderful collaboration. And yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Also in the chat, there's Shoair has placed a link that you could also click on and be able to have access. And Del had mentioned a name as well. So if you are a participant, please look at the chat, and there are some resources that are dropped there as well. I want to be extremely respectful of the time of our panelists and our speakers. I don't have food and wine to entice them with, unfortunately, this evening, or I perhaps would ask another question or 2. But I would like to first just thank you all extensively for the work that you all are doing. It is having a major impact on the conversations that are happening in the arts from different places, whether it's here in the States or if I talk to artists overseas. It is great to see the connectivity actually working. If you are in the audience, please look up the work that these women are doing, connect with them, sign up with their newsletters, and find ways to support them. And so that makes it easy to continue, because we are all friends of any champion of women. And we want to see this work be able to be pushed forward. We see the change that is happening in the world. I want to thank the UK committee. If you want to know more about what's happening at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, please join the UK committee and find out ways to connect with them as well. My name is Milani Douglas, and it has been such a pleasure to talk with you all. And we are closing out. And on behalf of Susan Fisher-Sterling and our board of directors, thank you very much for this conversation. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If the speakers could just hold one quick second. Literally, it'll be like 3 minutes.
Thank you for everything that you do just to say to you, but also to all of you here. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We have a small but mighty team. Amanda, has it stopped recording or no?